Thank you all for coming this morning. This building is 1858, but we're across the street from the 1844 site of the Pabst Brewery. So this is a really sort of holy ground in terms of Milwaukee's brewing history and Milwaukee's history in general. So I want to move beyond brewing, talk about basically the Milwaukee history and my own story. If I were to write my autobiography today, it would probably be called 44 Years of 1099s. And the subtitle would be No W-2 since 1972. It has been that long. So like many of you, I'm self-employed. I have been for a long time. Something of a misnomer, you're not employed unless someone pays you. But we are, in terms of the IRS, we are self-employed and file those Schedule Cs. And what I want to talk about this morning is beyond in the general theme, and in my case, going beyond the comforts and challenges of a traditional job by moving beyond the present into the past. So basically, the story of my career has been pretty consistent. What I do is Milwaukee history and always has been, but it's been largely unplanned, perhaps even improvised, and based on luck and timing as much as hard work and talent. First of all, I came to a love of history pretty late. I didn't have anything to do with history in college, and I began on the writing side of my profession. My major was actually English, and that was my first love, literature. And this was the 1960s when I graduated from BC back in 1969. That's a decade that America has never really forgiven, never really absorbed. It's still kind of out there being unassimilated. And I came home to Milwaukee back in '69. I always knew I'd come back home with a rather woolly notion that I'd be a poet. But those jobs were all taken when I arrived back in '69. So I began my post-college career as 1/3 of a house painting company called Tom Sawyer, which lasted until the weather turned cold and we no longer had our ladders to act as advertisement, the kind of word of mouth, so we were pretty much shut down. So I accepted a friend's offer, another third of Tom Sawyer, to volunteer at a Southside youth center called Journey House down on 16th and Washington, now Cesar Chavez in Washington. And that meant, again, in 60s parlance, not being part of the problem, being part of the solution. There is still a Journey House. It is enormously magnified from what it was back in those early years, back in 1960s and 70s. And pretty soon, I moved from a volunteer to working there full-time, became the assistant director, which was a rather loose title. I stayed for 3 years and did everything from teaching photography to running small groups to begging for material supplies for a sewing program, whatever we had to do. This was sort of everybody had to pitch in to do everything. This was, by definition, a shoestring operation. Our budget was $45,000 for a year. That paid for 5 staff people. It paid for rent. It paid for materials, supplies, whatever else we needed, as well as utilities. So it was fairly clear we had to be on sounder footing or we'd just sort of get washed away. So back in about 1972, a Vista volunteer and I decided to write what fundraisers today would call a case statement. And that meant answering questions like what were the neighborhood's needs, how had they developed, and what was Journey House doing to meet them. And what that meant was neighborhood research. And this had been beyond anything I had even remotely dreamed about doing. And for reasons that are still quite unclear to me, I drew the historical portion of that assignment. The Vista volunteer did more of the numbers side. And that is when the light bulb finally flashed on and when the clouds began to part and I began to see things much more clearly than I had. My roots are on the Polish south side of Milwaukee. I had not taken a history course since high school and had not been a big history fan even then. But here I was studying the history of my old neighborhood. And what I began to develop was a powerful sense of history as story. All these connections began to surface. All these links began to come together between my story and the stories of my family, my neighborhood, my city, my country, and the larger world. All of a sudden I'm seeing things in context instead of this kind of little atom kind of floating out there in the ether. So what I discovered, in short, was historical context, which was something sorely lacking back in the 1960s. Those of you who were around at that time recall that period as not just ahistorical, but anti-historical. We were creating a new world, so why spend any time thinking about the old one? So what happened was a lot of the babies went out with the bathwater as that process was working through American society. So the product of our research was a very primitive little booklet we titled Fearlessly, The Near South Side, A Delicate Balance. It's a tip between kind of poverty and prosperity, a past and a future. And it was published by a local nonprofit, an ecumenical social action group. And that led to a job with United Way, doing neighborhood research elsewhere on the South Side, kind of pioneering, kind of developing early methods of needs assessment. And when that project ended, during a period of unemployment, I worked for free, writing a somewhat less primitive pamphlet on that part of the South Side's history, and led to another research job in Waukesha County, again for United Way. So this is going on for 2 or 3 years. It begins to dawn on me, slowly, that this is a career. It might be something I could do here for a while. It also became more and more obvious I didn't know squat about my subject matter. And I was really ill-informed with an English major's background to kind of tackle history and geography. So I needed more tools, and I turned to UWM. And I quickly found a home there in the geography department. Neighborhoods were what I was doing in the southeastern Wisconsin, and I became interested in the broader intersection between place and time, and that is historical geography. So I did my master's thesis on Jones Island, which was a former fishing village at the mouth of the Milwaukee River. How many of you have been to Kashub's Park? That's really a high percentage. It's the smallest park in Milwaukee. It is maybe half the size or a third the size of this room. But that is the site of the last fishing settlement in Jones Island. At a time there had been 1,600 people living down there, bringing in 2 million pounds of fish a year. So just a fascinating kind of an urban village. And that was fun to do. But what I do to this day is history, but it's informed by a geographic perspective. What the program at UWM gave me was a respect for evidence, higher professional standards, and a small place in the community of scholars that helped me avoid the pitfalls of the self-taught. Kind of just going to go off the rails there. So as soon as I got my master's degree, I got back to work. I was married by then, had 1 kid in diapers, another one soon to come. And a project after graduation back in '78, I did a couple of books about neighborhoods, small ones, for a program funded by the NEH at WM. One on Bayview, where my wife and I moved soon after I graduated. Another on the West End, which is the area around 35th in Wisconsin, Merrill Park, Pigsville, Concordia, those 3 neighborhoods. And when that project ended in 2 years, so did my job. And the head of our advisory committee happened to be an executive at Northwestern Mutual who liked my work and asked if I'd write a history of his company. Whoa, going from neighborhoods to Northwestern Mutual. Another writer had backed out on the project. They have a habit of doing histories every 25 years and have done it since the 1880s. So this is a long tradition. And now consider this proposal from the viewpoint of a 60s kid. Northwestern virtually embodied the establishment. Conservative, buttoned down, traditional. So working for NML would have meant working for the man. Add to that the fact that I knew nothing about life insurance. I could not have told you what term and whole life meant, how they were different from one another. So did I agonize? Did I hesitate? Nope. Not for a second. I got beyond any misgivings I had. I had 2 kids in diapers and no prospects of any other kind. So I jumped in, and to my surprise and my great relief, it turned out to be just a fascinating project. Northwestern was like learning a new neighborhood. It had its own culture, own story, its own characters. And I made a lot of friends there. I still do work for them. This goes back to 1982. And that 25-year cycle, I did the next one in 2007. So repeat business, as you know, for freelancers is very important. Sometimes you have to wait a quarter century, but it will come around. So that has been the rhythm of my career since the 1980s. One part's been commission work, sometimes for companies like Northwestern or Miller Brewing or Marcus or We Energies. Other times for nonprofits like the Jewish Museum or Forest Home Cemetery or St. Joseph's Basilica. The other part is community work, usually projects I choose and try to find funding for. I've been doing my own version of crowdfunding for years, in my case, largely working with foundations and corporations. So by the mid-90s, I gathered so many pieces of local history that I felt the need to put that whole puzzle together. The result 4 years later was The Making of Milwaukee, which, as Paul said, was the first full-length history since 1948. So there was a niche there. There was an opening there. It's done really well, especially for a local title. Published by the County Historical Society, it's sold more than 26,000 copies to date, and we are now raising funds for a 4th edition, so it's determined to kind of keep this thing in print and up to date. I knew even before the ink was dry that Milwaukee Story was too good to be confined to a book, so I started working with Milwaukee PBS, the old MPTV, it's now rebranded as Milwaukee PBS, and the result of that collaboration was a 5-hour TV series called The Making of Milwaukee. It made Channel 10 the most watched public TV station in America for 4 nights running, when it was aired back in 2006 and won a Midwest Emmy for Best Documentary. So the hardware is the same. It looks like an Emmy, but it's regional. It's the Chicago sort of upper Midwest market. So last October, we aired the 10th anniversary update of The Making of Milwaukee called The Next Chapter, and the whole series is still very much in Channel 10's broadcast rotation. What I tapped into was an enormous appetite, a vein for local history, and I kept at it. The next large project was Milwaukee City of Neighborhoods, which was based on those ubiquitous neighborhood posters you recall from back in the 1980s, and some lucky winners will take away note cards today with images from that series. And most people had no idea on the back of every one of those posters was an essay I wrote about the histories of those areas. So if it was hung for display, they went away forever. These things are 30 years old. People have no idea something's written on the backs of those posters. So working with Historic Milwaukee, Inc., the task was to update those first 27 essays and add 10 more and put them between the covers of a book that weighs 6.5 pounds. It's on the table back here. Heavy reading, and has become kind of a grassroots Bible in Milwaukee. My current project, I finished the draft, what's today, Friday, I finished it on Tuesday, is a book called Milwaukee City Built on Water, which will be published next spring by the State Historical Society. If you hadn't noticed, water's really hot these days. It's really a hot topic. And this book will tell the story from first to last. Most of my time has been spent on these larger writing projects, but the invitations have come along every so often. I've been writing a local history column for the Journal Sentinel since 1994, and lately, in the last few years, just because I felt the need to, laced with political commentary. The next issue will be one about the Pabst's return to the old Forstkeller, just up the street here, after being absent since 1996. And I'm about to start season 7 as the bike riding historian for Around the Corner with John McGivern, which is another show that's doing really well. So that's my story. What's the point? I would not presume to offer my career path as a case study of how to start a career and pursue one. In many cases, it's just the opposite. But I hope I can at least stand here as living proof that it is possible to do something you love, make a living at it, and do something good for the world as well. My larger hope is that you will give greater consideration to the role the past can play, especially Milwaukee's past, and how useful it can be. History is where the present comes from. It has no place else to come from. History is why things are the way they are. And it's on the local level especially that history is the easiest to grasp. That's where all the drama and the color and the meaning really come to life. So in Milwaukee, back in 1854, a runaway slave named Joshua Glover was rescued and prompted the Wisconsin Supreme Court to declare the Federal Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional. No one did that. Wisconsin was the only state in the Union to do that. In 1886, militia troops shot and killed 7 workers marching for the 8-hour day, nothing more or less than the 8-hour day. In 1890, immigrants and their kids made up 86% of Milwaukee's population. We were the most foreign city in the entire country, almost 90%. Wonder where the ethnic festivals come from? You know, we've been at this for a very long time. Milwaukee was known as the beer capital of America, and Pabst was the largest back in 1874 for the first time. At various other times, we've been the world's largest shipper of wheat, tanner of leather, and manufacturer of diversified machinery. We are the only city in America of any size to elect socialists as mayors for most of 50 years, and that legacy is still very much with us. 50 years ago this summer, Milwaukeeans marched for 200 consecutive nights for open housing. So we marked the semi-centennial of that event. So every place is unique. These stories are ours, but Milwaukee is a more unique place than most. And how we know that is history. But history has other gifts to offer, and one of the most important, I think, is perspective. Although we all know better, we grow up thinking that things were always the way they are now, that the world as we know it, was somehow preordained and fixed. History explodes that notion. History puts things in motion. It teaches us that nothing had to happen, nothing is inevitable, and teaches us that everything is on its way to becoming something else. History, in really simple terms, is nothing more than the study of change. So just look at the people around you here at Pabst, the clothing, the hairstyles, the shoes. I can guarantee you with absolute certainty that 50 years from now, everything everyone in this room is wearing will be vintage. I can guarantee you that every car in the streets outside, if they are still running, will be a classic and something you see in parades, not on the streets. I can guarantee you that every tune you now download to your mobile device will be an oldie, if it's played at all. And your descendants, if you're lucky enough to have them, will someday find your photograph, maybe on a cloud, maybe in a hologram, and think how curiously antique you look. I say that with absolute certainty. And what that means is that we are sharing a single historical moment, one that places us together between a million moments before us and millions more to come. That means we're all in this together. We are the only link, the living bridge between past and future. And what we do with or to this world, this society, and this city will shape the lives of all those who are to come. That sense of shared fate, that sense of shared responsibility, is something I think is really on the ropes in America today, really seriously endangered. There are numerous ways to restore a healthier balance, and the one I'm pursuing on my home turf is local history. History, again, is story. I believe in the power of story to shape our understanding of who we are as individuals. I believe in the power of shared story to shape a sense of who we are as a community. The communal story is what I tell. It's a modest endeavor, to be sure, but I undertake it in the service of something even larger. My hope is that by helping people put their stories in the context of our story, I can help to close some of that very troubling gap between the individual and society, between the I and the we, as that gap continues to yawn so widely. My ultimate goal is to encourage a sense of ownership and finally a sense of belonging for everyone who calls Milwaukee home. But it all starts with story. And so in closing, please consider moving beyond your individual stories to see them as part of a larger story in which we all play a role. Grow where you're planted, love where you live.